Hello, I know I said that the next video was going to be part 2 of my Thames trip, but that will now be the video after this one because we have, what is in canal terms, some breaking news, and that is that the government has announced the funding that the Canal River Trust is going to get for the 10 years from 2027 onwards. Now, a quick bit of history if you're unfamiliar with it. The Canal and River Trust is a charitable body set up to look after the 2,000 plus miles of canals and rivers in the UK. It sprang out of an old government department, British Waterways. The canals, of course, built between 200, 300 years ago as a key part of the Industrial Revolution that transformed Britain. It made mass manufacturing and distribution of goods possible. They were hugely significant and now today are pretty much a leisure activity, but they are living heritage. They are a key part of our history, and at least to me, it is very important that we keep the canals going. Now, the Canal and River Trust has an annual budget of around £200 million, of which a quarter of it, 50 million a year, comes from a government grant. It was always the case that that grant was going to be up for renewal in 2027, and we've been waiting on tenterhooks to see what the government had to say. They've just announced now what the plan for the subsequent 10 years is, and unfortunately that 50 million is going to go down by 5% each year for the subsequent 10 years, leaving it eventually at around just over £30 million a year. Now you might say, okay, that sounds like a very gentle decline, but of course there is also inflation and costs of things are just going up. So the hit to the Canal and River Trust is quite significant, and they are quite disappointed in what they've been offered, even though they are pleased to have been offered any money at all. Well, to get the full gen on the situation, I'm here at Hatton Locks, where the Chief Executive Officer of the Canal and River Trust, Richard Parry, has agreed once more to do a full sit-down interview with me. It's a long one, but he goes into all the detail, and I've pitched various questions at him that I've had from viewers about what this funding decision is going to mean. Richard, you've said this is going to cost you £300 million over 10 years. Now, I've done a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation, and I reckon it's 110 million. Are you scaremongering to try and whip people up into a frenzy or something?
Well, we've allowed for inflation in what we've said, David. And I mean, first of all, even if it was 100 million, that's still a big number, but it is something like 300 million when you look at the effect of inflation. I mean, I think we'd all recognise that, £100 in 2035 isn't going to be the same as £100 today, or indeed £100 a couple of years ago. So it's about recognising where the trajectory, if I can use that word, of our funding would have taken us to, just allowing for inflation, no increase in real terms, and comparing that with the reduction, because they're year-on-year reductions. The DEFRA grant settlement announced on Monday would take us down steadily year on year. So the gap is widening every year. And indeed, if you look beyond 2036, when the current agreement will come to an end, actually the gap is going to be very substantial going into the future as well. So the 300 million is allowing for inflation and looking at that path that the funding will be on compared with the funding that we've had in the past.
Now, as you said, whichever way you look at it, it's a big chunk of money. What is that going to mean for the Canal and River Trust, for boaters, for other users of the canal? What tangibly happens if you simply don't have that money?
Well, clearly we are set up to care for the waterways in perpetuity. So our absolute driving mission is to do that. Clearly, the cost of doing that can't be ignored, and so we will be, and indeed we already have been, because of the impact of what's happened with inflation in the last 2 years, we will be looking even more thoroughly to the future at how we can make the money work. Clearly, we aren't entirely dependent on grant. There are other sources of income, so we're investing considerably in increasing our own fundraising capability. We're also looking, of course, at how we can find any other opportunities to grow commercial income, other innovative opportunities that we might explore. And clearly we've got to look at how we run the organisation. Where are there opportunities to reduce costs? Now, we have been doing that already because that's the world that we're in, and the inflation effect of the last 2 years has meant we have been effectively resizing, re-examining the organisation. That work will have to continue. But the message that we've given this week is that there is a limit to the extent to which that can happen. Ultimately, with the funding from government that we've seen this week, We do not think that projecting forwards in 5, 8, 10 years, it will be possible to keep navigation open across the whole of the waterway network. The cost of doing that will exceed the resources we will have available.
Doesn't the Transport Act of 1968 actually compel you to keep the waterways open? So all this sort of potential closures, you can't do that.
Well, it's certainly a challenge that we'd have to address if we ever got to that point, David. Let me just say, we're very determined that we will find a way through this so that canal closures are averted. But looking at the financial scenarios that have now been presented, it's something we are going to have to take seriously. Let's just note that there are 3 categories of waterways: remainder, cruising, commercial. So clearly we will be having to be mindful of those different designations as we look to the future. So that's just something to bear in mind. Ultimately, if we don't have the funds, then we would not be able to maintain a waterway for navigation. Now, how that plays out legally is something we will have to understand very carefully. It is not something that is part of our preferred strategy. It's something that we will, over the next few years, because let's remember, this is looking some years into the future, we will have to prepare ourselves for. But it absolutely would be the worst case to be entertaining that sort of step. The legal process would have to be understood, and if necessary, something would have to be worked through that could even mean some sort of declassification of that relevant stretch of waterway. As I say, we haven't thought about it. It's something that would have to be addressed at that time in that scenario, which, let me say again, is one we're very, very anxious to avoid.
You're potentially saying, you would say to government, this isn't a canal, this is a ditch. It's not ours, it's just a ditch full of water, suddenly.
Well, it wouldn't be quite put in that kind of very, very blunt way, but we'd be saying we can no longer maintain this section of canal for navigation. I mean, let's remember, you go back 100 and plus years.
But you have to maintain them for navigation, therefore you have to make it not a canal. That's the way round, is it?
Okay, well, you may be ahead of me. I don't think that's quite how it would necessarily work, but it's academic in a way, David. We would have to see what the particular solution was at that particular point in time for that particular waterway. And as I say, it's very much our worst case fallback. It's many years away, I very much hope, before we got anywhere near that sort of outcome. But we have to, because I'm very serious about delivering the message that says, with the funding that's been announced, that isn't something we can reassure people won't happen. It is very much a possibility unless we can resolve the long-term funding for the waterways.
You've known that this review is coming, presumably ever since they gave you the first settlement. It had an end date on it. So you must have had plans and been drawing up plans all this time for the possible contingencies, always assuming that you might get less, because governments rarely hand out more. So do you know what waterways might that be? How many lock miles we would lose on the network if that happened?
We haven't got a plan that's in that level of detail, David. I mean, clearly one understands which canals are the most heavily used, the most popular, which canals are the most costly to maintain because of their structures, their history. So, when one's looking to the future, clearly that sort of information will be taken into account. But I am very clear that our purpose is to argue for the retention of the entire network. Let me put that very clearly. We aren't sitting here, working out which ones we're going to close in some sort of, defeatist pattern. We're determined to be galvanised by this to make the strong case for the settlement to be improved so that we don't enter a world in which we're contemplating those sort of closures. Now, I know there's a big leap to get to that because this settlement has just been announced, but it's 3.5 years away. We've seen already a very strong response to the announcement. We will have a new government in 12 to 18 months' time of whatever variety. It'll be a brand new government with a 5-year term, looking to the future. And, the case that we have made, the benefits that waterways deliver, I'm very confident that there will be opportunities for further conversations about what is needed to invest in their long-term care.
Surely you've made the strongest case that could be made, and if you haven't, why haven't you? Is there anything more that can be said?
Well, we've tried. The review has been very disappointing in its outcome. And I think anyone who's seen the report that was published, I think a day after the original announcement, will be, I think, surprised at just how brief the review report is. So, we don't feel that the the evidence that we provided, the argument that we've made, has been fully taken into account. And that may be a product of all the other factors going on around government, right now. So, we think there is ample evidence to make the case for waterways, and we believe that the next 3.5 years will afford the opportunity for that to happen.
Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, you can pretty much always assume that governments never want to give you more money for anything. So it's always going to be likely that your grant was going to be reduced. And I think I'm right in saying the grant's about 1/4 of your income anyway, and the other 150 or so from your 200 million comes from other sources. Is it not incumbent upon you to almost say, let's forget the government grant because we know that's going to reduce? Actually, forget about cost cutting. What we really need to be concentrating on is generating revenue. And that should be your big focus.
100%, completely get that. And we have done an awful lot. And let's remember, we've done an awful lot since 2012 already. But there's undoubtedly the potential to do more. And clearly, the more the sense of jeopardy is introduced, the more people will realise that the canals that maybe to some extent are taken for granted, that people use every day without fully appreciating the scale of investment that's needed, we can open people's minds, businesses, other partners, so that they understand that they need to contribute if we're to retain what we all value so much today.
I'm going to chip in some ideas that were sent in to me by various viewers. For example, can you and would you and will you bill local councils that have benefit from the waterways coming through? Could you have moorings, could you open marinas and do hire boating and all the commercial activities that firms do? Why is the CRT footing the bill for things like bridge strikes by cars? Shouldn't you claw that money from the Highways Agency? And are you going to bill non-boaters and non-anglers, other canal users somehow? I don't know how it would work, but there must be other people. Can you get businesses to sponsor a lock like you get businesses sponsoring a roundabout on the roads?
Yeah. Well, some of that, yes. Some of that is outside of our powers, outside of our control. So bridge strikes, goodness knows we don't want to pay for them, but it just happens that legally that's our responsibility. And there really isn't anyone else queuing up to take that responsibility from us. So, we are, I'm afraid, stuck with that. Likewise, the idea of finding some of the neighbours or the council who benefit from the waterway being there, getting them to contribute. Well, again, there's no mechanism for us to do that. We simply can't introduce of our own volition some charging structure where they'd all be obliged. So some of this can be about a conversation, with government, maybe about changing the law in some respects. So maybe that can introduce more opportunities or relieve us of some of those burdens. But it's not like there are others in the public sector who are queuing up to take on more costs. So I would put that in the unlikely category. But things like sponsorship, partnerships with business, other ways in which we can, monetize, that horrible word, the waterways, absolutely. As for the towpath users, which I think is the big group you were talking about, the big offer that we make is that it's free at the point of use to come onto the towpaths. That is the public benefit that government effectively is paying for. I think it would be very counterproductive, even if one could find a mechanism, and as you acknowledge, very difficult to think what that would be, to oblige people to pay. We want to encourage people to contribute. That's been the purpose of our Friends programme and other ways in which people are encouraged to donate. And we will certainly be, turbocharging that effort, because we do want the 10 million people or so who use the towpaths to recognise, what they're getting from the towpath being there, the risk that it might not be available if they don't make some contribution. So we absolutely do want to appeal to those people to make a voluntary contribution to the Trust. I think trying to make it more than that would be both extremely difficult and ineffective.
A very sharp-eyed viewer spotted that in your, I think, last set of accounts, you've got something like almost £1 billion marked as reserves, albeit that most of that is marked as reserved reserves. Hello, you've got £1 billion. Let's spend that, please.
Well, let's explain about our endowment, because most of the figure that you're talking about is our endowment. So when we were created, we were given, or we took with us, the property estate that the British Waterways Organisation had accumulated through development and other such things, and we have successfully grown that. We've diversified that investment into non-property sources. We've swapped out a lot of the property that we have, and we've grown the value of that endowment to about £1 billion. But that is absolutely outside of our day-to-day spend. So it's so important for our long-term future that that endowment yields an annual return. So about 50 million of our current spend every year comes from the return that we gain from using that endowment. But if we were to diminish that endowment, it would not be there for the future.
What you're saying is it's a bit like me owning a house. I notionally have the value of my house, but if I wanted to spend it, I'd be homeless.
In effect, that's the same sort of mechanism, David. It would be very tempting to sort of chip away at it, but everything you took from that would leave you with a reduced income stream in the future. So in effect, you'd be taking the future income and using it now, leaving the future without the income that will be needed just as much then. So when we were set up, there was a protector in place specifically for the purpose of restricting us from ever using that endowment for day-to-day operational running. Now, that arrangement is relaxing a little bit, so we haven't quite got the same scrutiny and oversight, but the same principle will apply. It would be extremely bad business for us, me today, to be effectively handicapping my successors by drawing down money that is there for the long-term future of the waterways. So we have to be strict about not using that endowment for costs that occur today.
Where do massive unexpected costs come into play, such as the Toddbrook Reservoir restoration? That's a huge chunk of money that no one would have foreseen. Who's paying for that?
Well, the Trust is paying for that, and indeed all the other reservoir work that we're doing at the moment. We're spending about £25 million a year on a whole range of reservoirs. I think we're doing 19 reservoir projects this year.
So even the big and unexpected ones you have to cough up for. There's no extra government money for that.
There is no extra money.
Then a follow-up question for that is, Toddbrook could have been an absolute disaster, and there are other bits around the network that fail dramatically every now and again, and a lot of boaters say that the CRT spends its time slapping a patch on things that are going wrong, which is cheap, but then it'll break and then you have to slap a patch on again. Wouldn't it be better long-term to do a proper repair job for so many of the bits on the canal network? Yes, it's going to cost you a bit to start with, but overall, it'll be better. Why is there sort of slapping blasters on all the time?
Well, I wouldn't quite accept the premise, David, but understandably, when we're looking at our intervention around the assets, if I can put it in that way, we have a range of interventions. Sometimes we will do a full repair where we recognise that actually the patch option is not a good idea, and we have the capacity, both people and know-how and time and money, we will plan a really sort of significant intervention. Sometimes, particularly when things are discovered and they need fixing quite quickly, we will go in and do something that will be, if you like, a life-extending piece of work. So, lock gates are often the simplest. Sometimes we will plan to replace a lock gate. Sometimes we will go in and we'll replank it. We will do something to kind of give it a few more years' life so that we don't have to go in and replace that lock gate this year because we can get a few more years' life out of it. And it's a constant trade-off, of course it is. It has to always be looked at in the round. What resources have we got available? What is the whole range of priorities that we've got? And how do you, if you like, play tunes with that to make sure you're providing the best possible outcome? Minimising the risk, because as you say, a lot of this is about risk to neighbouring communities as well as just the canal users themselves. And a lot of it is about the sort of the function and usage of the canal and making sure that we minimise the number of failures by intervening in a timely and effective way to ensure that things can stay available for use. And that will sometimes be a 20-year life for replacement. It'll sometimes be a shorter term intervention just to buy us the time until we can put it in the full programme.
Sometimes you think you're buying time and then the whole thing fails. It was, we should have done it properly in the first place.
Inevitably, again, without going too far into the science of infrastructure and asset management, that is, you're almost always going to find occasions like that. No organisation running big national infrastructure is ever going to have a 100% success rate. Your engineers will make an assessment. I think that's got 2 years more life. We'll put it in the programme for 2 years, and then, as you say, 6 months later it fails, and you think, well, we got that one wrong. But of course, you never know the ones you got right because they don't fail and you carry on. And in a way, when you're running things on a very tight budget, if you intervene too early, that's almost as much of a problem. Because if everything has a shorter life because you go in too early, well then you're spending significant millions of pounds you didn't need to spend, and you can't afford to do that. That will almost certainly mean that by spending on something too early, something else will then emerge as a problem. So you've constantly got to make that assessment about when is the right timing, asset by asset, for that intervention, and then put it all together in a dynamic plan that's of course changing all the time, because we'll get a failure next week, next month, and we'll have to change the plan to respond to that, and then put the plan back together to see what we've had to juggle to make sure we can still stay on programme.
I'm going to loop back almost to where we started, which was the talk of potentially canal closures. When you and I last met, it was at the reopening of a section of the Montgomery Canal, one of many, many canal restorations currently underway across the country. If you're now talking about potentially closures, should the restoration groups just hang up their shovels and call it quits? Because if they start finishing their restorations, then they hand the canals over to you. It's even more burden for the CRT. Should they just say, actually, this is not going to happen, let's stop?
They shouldn't do that. They should absolutely carry on. There's so much, pioneering, enterprising spirit in the restoration movement. We absolutely need to, cherish and nurture and promote that. But it has to be seen in context, David. I think if anything, what may be just a very small sort of helpful thing about this is to remind people that the core network can't be taken for granted. So sometimes there's lots of excitement about adding a little bit more to the canal network, and that is great. I celebrate that. Fantastic when it happens, and the people involved, huge tribute to them and the commitment they make. But let's not forget that the core network needs investment too. And so it has to be seen in that context that the focus on keeping the core network available, invested in, has to come first, and the restorations hopefully can continue around it, not either or, but it certainly can't be a focus on the restorations sort of almost at the expense of the core network. And we have to keep the core network as our priority. Certainly that's the Trust point of view, but we celebrate the fact that there are many volunteer groups doing lots to promote, because often it's about raising awareness of waterways. I was at an event at the Chesterfield Canal as well as the Montgomery, and it's been amazing how those communities have really been galvanised by the activity of that restoration. And that helps us, of course, because it brings more people to the canals to celebrate the existing canals as well as the restored canals.
A couple of years ago, the CRT kind of rebranded itself as a health and well-being charity. I don't know if that was, I can't remember if that started before the pandemic or came out because of the pandemic, but that was your big push. It was, look, government, we're not just for boaters having their middle-class holidays, as someone put it to me on Twitter, but we're for everyone. And we've seen people walking behind you as we're doing this chat, people getting out in the fresh air. But was health and well-being, because it seemed to be quite a big pillar, was that really the best angle to go in on to try and persuade the government of the canal's wider value?
Well, it was certainly one of them, and there's no doubt that has very broad appeal. I mean, you've only got to look at the narrative coming out of government and indeed opposition parties and lots of other agencies to see how critically important. And as you said, David, the pandemic absolutely reinforced that. We actually launched the well-being message in 2018, so ahead of the pandemic. And for me, it was never a new add-on thing. It was always just describing what was plainly there. I mean, you talk to people who've been boating since the 1960s, and actually, the word that you'd use to describe what they gained was well-being. It's actually about their mental health, their kind of state of mind. So it wasn't a new idea. It was really just making explicit something that it had in effect been implicit, and then making it inclusive, making that then something for the communities in particularly the urban areas where we have such chronic problems with health, etc.
Sure, but was this the right angle to prod at the government with? For example, 60% of my audience to the YouTube channel is from outside the UK. An awful lot of them send me messages saying, I've enjoyed watching the video so much, I'm going to book a holiday on a narrowboat. Tourism, not just within the UK, but from outside the UK, could be a huge thing. And excuse me, that I don't think it barely got or even got a mention in your press release as being an important thing. Okay. Do you acknowledge the importance of overseas tourism for the canals, and has that angle been pressed to government? Because if there's one thing governments love, it's overseas money.
Yeah, no, well, I take your challenge about whether we've given it enough emphasis, but we absolutely have made it part of the argument. I mean, the piece of work we did that showed that there was £1.5 billion of economic benefit from having the canals and all the associated activities absolutely did capture that overseas component. And we talk, to the parts of DCMS that are about tourism. We talk to Visit England, Visit Britain, and others, absolutely to promote the fact that waterways are a key part of that overseas offer. So it's both, really. I mean, we know that when you're talking about the government's highest priorities, that health and well-being message for the millions of people in the UK is central to it, but the economic benefit of tourism is an absolutely complementary part of it as well. And we have tried to talk about both. Waterways, canals, after all, touch a whole range of opportunities. They are about biodiversity. We talk a lot about that and nature recovery. That's clearly very important to DEFRA, very important to government. We talk about climate and what we can contribute to in terms of helping alleviate climate change. There's roles that waterways can play there as well. So it's a combination of all of those things.
We know that, but the government doesn't seem to recognise it.
Well, if you read the report, I mean, someone made this observation to me, they have a list of all the great benefits that canals provide, leading you to the conclusion that they're going to want to sustain them, and then the punchline doesn't quite land. Now, government, in fairness, is making a commitment. It's a 10-year commitment, and actually, if you look at the positives from the settlement, they didn't have to offer us another long-term settlement, so we successfully made the argument for that, and they have made a financial contribution. They could argue that after 2027, there was no obligation on them to do that. So we have at least had a partial success in demonstrating that there's benefit that government should be supporting. Now, what we failed to do is to demonstrate the quantum of that. I don't believe they've given enough, the 300 million short, to enable us to keep the network open. It's almost like they haven't quite had the courage of their convictions to say, we need to properly fund this because the benefits are so important. And it isn't, of course, just the benefits, it's the risks to communities as well. Because unlike perhaps other things where government's making a yes or no choice or scaling up and down the spend, the waterways will still be here. They won't vanish, they will just deteriorate if we don't spend on them. And that deterioration can be quite a high risk for neighbouring communities. So, we have got to make sure that safety message in the work we do and in the case for investment comes out as strongly as the benefits case. It needs to be a combination of both.
You talked about potentially closing waterways. Yeah. Could you, if you needed to, threaten government with, we'll just hand them all back to you?
Not really. When the trust was created, we were handed ownership of the waterways in perpetuity. Now, there have been, written in the small print, various mechanisms whereby if the trust was to have in some respect failed, then it would default back to government. But that was very much initiated, outside of the trust rather than by the trust, if you like. So in that scenario, you'd effectively have to have, measures like the whole board of trustees being replaced and other such things. It wouldn't be something the trust had the option to do. So, we aren't contemplating that. We absolutely want to retain the network and to succeed in securing the resources to care for it. And I think it would be decline rather than handover. Now, none of us can anticipate what the world would look like in 10, 12, 15 years' time if we did have a scenario where we've been unsuccessful with the funding, we're facing these difficult choices about investment. Who knows what models may emerge at that point. But it isn't going to be a model where we can just hand it back to government.
Let us, for the final couple of points, talk tangible action that I, as a canal user, viewers of my videos who enjoy the canals, basically any random citizen, both of the UK and overseas, who likes the canals and thinks, well, this is bad, apart from simply writing you a cheque, what can they do?
Well, we need people to basically use their voice, okay? So yes, donations are very welcome, absolutely. But the key objective for this campaign, Keep Canals Alive, is to raise our voices, have a groundswell of public opinion that reaches MPs, that reaches ministers, that sustains a message.
How? Is it emailing? Is it writing? What can people overseas do? Let's have some actual bullet points.
On our website, go to the page, Keep Canals Alive. You can't miss it, right in the centre of the home page, as you would expect. Click through to that. It will guide you through what you can do to write to, if you're in the UK, to your MP, if you're overseas, how to kind of, lend your support as well. So it's all laid out there on our website. So people go to that. Maybe you could put the link in your message, David, and then we can promote that. The key thing, though, to get across is this isn't a sort of a 2-week campaign. This isn't trying to get this overturned straight away. That is not going to happen. We know that. This is about shifting the priorities for the future. So we need to get the message across that anything that jeopardises the future of our waterways by underfunding them has to be averted. And so the government to come, 12 to 18 months away from an election, there will be a fresh government, whoever it is, looking to the future. We have to make part of their consideration, a small one perhaps compared with other things, but nevertheless significant, is how do we make sure that these vastly important waterways, with all the benefits they deliver, is retained. And I think there is the time and place for that conversation, but it needs the groundswell to keep us on the agenda. So for the next 12, 18 months, we need to keep the campaign mobilised, active, so that MPs are constantly hearing from us, this is something that people care about. Everyone can make a difference. I mean, people often think, well, I'm just one voice, what can I do? If we add up everyone's voices, it can, become a big mighty roar if we do it together. And often the choices that people make, I'm optimistic that we can see this change because, governments do things thoughtlessly. I think this has been a pretty short-sighted decision by this administration. I think that can change when people come and look at it in a fresh light, understanding how important the waterways are. So I encourage people to be optimistic about the chances of having this revisited. I think that can happen, and if everyone plays a part, well, that will absolutely increase our chances.
So there you have it. If you are fond of the canals, don't just shake your head in disappointment and do nothing. It's up to all of us, basically, to shake and rattle some sticks and stones and make some noise and say to the people in power, the canals need more money than you're offering them, because the benefits of the canals, they're not just nice things that people go on holidays on. There are all sorts of benefits to everybody to have a canal that is in good order. So the link for the webpage that Richard talked about is in the description below. Go and click on that, email your MP. If you are outside the UK, you can join the Trust, become a friend of the Trust, or send a donation, and they will be very happy about that. So thanks for watching. Cheerio.